Good day. Let me greet the participants in the Riga conference of 2012. I participated in that conference back in 2006, and I recall that it was a wide-ranging, very constructive, very incisive, and a very impressive discussion. So I wish I could be with you, but with the modern age being what it is, I can participate from afar and at least send you my greetings and share one basic thought regarding the relationship between Europe and Russia, and of course, in a sense, more specifically, between Latvia as a member of Europe and Russia, because I know that this will be a significant part of your discussion in the conference. If I was taking part in it, what I would have said to the participants is essentially this: that in thinking of the relationship with Russia, one has to have both a short time frame in mind and a longer one as well. And the two relate to each other in what might be said as somewhat dialectical fashion. The short one is ambiguous, to some extent even gives grounds for concern. But in the long run, I feel very confident in saying that the prospects for a constructive relationship with Russia are going to be improving in the longer run, because I believe firmly that Russia will be experiencing in the last decade or two further, but perhaps even more basic political transformation than what it has already experienced. Today we have, of course, in power in Russia a president who in many respects is rather nostalgic about the Soviet era. He wishes the Soviet Union still would exist. He once described, and mind you, he was speaking of the 20th century, a century of 2 world wars and the Holocaust and mass murders. He once said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the most regrettable event in the course of the entire century. And he is now propagating, as we all know, the notion of a Eurasian Union emerging on much of the territory of the former Soviet Union. There is a certain element of historical nostalgia, but more importantly, of strategic unreality in that kind of a view, because it is divorced not only from current circumstances, but even more so from the likely future circumstances. The fact of the matter is that Russia, to be successful itself in the long run, has to become more closely associated with Europe, because otherwise the combination of an increasingly empty territory, population decline, brain drain abroad, and an economy which in the most important sectors of technology and industry is stagnant, but is totally dependent on the export of energy, much of which then goes into private pockets and is then redeployed back to the West. That is not a condition that can endure indefinitely. Moreover, very few of the former members of the Soviet Union will wish to be truly members of a new Eurasian Union, which is a slightly altered name for the former Soviet Union. So his perspective on the future, I think, is really not based on realistic calculations. But for the moment, he's dominant, and for the moment, it is important to deal with him in a responsible fashion. And so I favor, for example, the reset policy between the United States and Russia, provided that reset policy remains sensitive to the security interests of the eastern members of NATO. But beyond that, we have to be also cognizant of the fact that there is social change in Russia that is much more hopeful. Even though Putin dominates the political scene, there's something very important about the way he's viewed by the Russians that underlines how different the reality of Russia already is. He is the first all-powerful leader of Russia who's not feared. If anything, he's increasingly ridiculed, laughed at for some of his personal stunts. And the absence of fear in the Russian political process is a sign of something far more basic, of a change in the political culture, and is associated with the growing influence in Russia of a new, more Western-oriented middle class, thousands and tens of thousands of whom have studied in the West, hundreds of thousands of whom travel to the West, and most of whom partake of the Western lifestyle and increasingly Western political aspirations. So my view of Russia in the longer run is something much more hopeful, namely of a Russia that will become increasingly tied to Europe, and that will of course have to be preceded by even closer links between Ukraine and the West, with Ukraine at the same time remaining on a positive relationship with Russia. That is the perspective I have. That is a perspective which of course is subject to debate and discussion, but my sense is that one can look forward to a period in history in which the fundamental political gap that separated the West from the East when talking of Eurasia will be closing, and that Russia itself will eventually become a much more successful and important partner of the West in building a new West with far greater ambitions and opportunities at a time in the world in which such larger scale cooperation is absolutely essential if we are to avoid growing international turmoil, regional conflicts, a variety of problems which the West and the East in the past have never faced and which in the future they'll have to address together. So I wish you a very successful meeting, and I wish I could be with you.